It's 12:01. I think we're about ready to start. Welcome, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Thompson. I'm a professor of history and Farsi Chair of Islamic Peace at American University. I also head the Islamic and Middle East Studies Initiative at the university. As we meet here today, millions of Syrian citizens are suffering, living in poorly constructed refugee camps and makeshift homes. No protection from the winter cold, no assurance of food, no doctors even, as the COVID pandemic threatens. Other Syrians languish in prisons or subsist in makeshift shelters within Syria 10 years after their first cries for freedom and dignity brought state violence upon them. The United States policy in Syria has disappointed all and been condemned by many. Our country stood by as chemical weapons were used and as outside powers helped to turn peaceful protest into civil war. When Syrians sought refuge outside their country, or for a time in the northern region of Syria, our country offered little support. In fact, our previous president chose to withdraw troops who had protected some in the northern enclave. I am a historian of Syria who has studied the catastrophe of World War I 100 years ago in that country. It caused 500,000 to die of famine and disease, even as Allied ships continued to blockade the Syrian coast. After World War I, our feeble effort to support a democratic state, and Woodrow Wilson did in fact support such a state, collapsed as powerful politicians chose instead to support the European colonization of the region. And so it is imperative that we consider what our new president might do to ease the suffering of the Syrian people and to encourage the establishment of a lawful government that must undertake the immense effort needed to rebuild the country. We are privileged in the United States for the public space on our college campuses to permit debate on critical issues like this one. In 2017, we at AU hosted a series entitled After Aleppo that brought together Syrian and American scholars to discuss the civil war and paths toward peace. In 2019, we organized a teach-in on northern Syria. And last fall, we hosted a showing of the documentary about doctors under siege in Aleppo called For Sama. This spring term, we continue the conversation. Today's panel is the first of two sessions that we will devote to Syria. Those assembled here today will address the policymaking issues from an inside the Beltway perspective, so to speak. They're all experts on American policy in the past and on options that lie before us for future policy. And I welcome all of you and thank you all for taking the time for joining us. Later this spring, we will convene another panel to represent the many Syrian perspectives on the country's future. For it must be under the initiative of Syrians themselves that future policy must be devised. Now, I introduce to you Dr. Mustafa Gürbüz, who organized today's panel and who will moderate the discussion. Dr. Gürbüz is a sociologist who teaches at AU's Arab World Studies program and has been a fellow at George Mason University and a policy advisor and commentator in the news media. He is author of Rival Kurdish Movements in Turkey, Transforming Ethnic Conflict. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gürbüz and our speakers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. It's Arab Spring 10 years on, and your highly acclaimed recent book on the Syrian Arab Congress of 1920 provides best evidence that democratic aspirations of the Arab people have long been on the move. So please check out Professor Thompson's latest book, How the West Stole Democracy from the Arabs, the Syrian Arab Congress of 1920, and the destruction of its historic liberal Islamic alliance. And we have a great panel today and a great audience with more than 300 participants in the room right now. Before introducing our panelists, I have a few notes on housekeeping. You can ask your questions via chat box in your Zoom screen. Please direct your question to one of the speakers and write your name and affiliation if it's not confidential. So we'll do our best to secure 20 minutes at the very end for Q&A session, and we will end the event about 1:15 Eastern Time. Now, let me quickly introduce our panelists today in the order of their names. Aaron Stein is the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He is also the Director of the Middle East Program and Acting Director of the National Security Program. Previously, Dr. Stein was a resident senior fellow of the Atlantic Council, where he managed their Turkey-related research program, oversaw work on Iran and non-state actors in the Middle East. He was a doctoral fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy in Switzerland, an associate fellow of the Royal United Services Institute in London, and non-proliferation program manager at the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies in Istanbul. We have Amy Holmes, who is currently an international affairs fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a fellow at the Wilson Center. She has a PhD from Johns Hopkins University with expertise on US security relations and contentious politics in Europe and the Middle East. Dr. Holmes previously served as associate professor of sociology at the American University in Cairo and has held visiting scholar positions at Harvard University and Brown University. A former Fulbright scholar in Germany, she is the author of Coups and Revolutions, Mass Mobilization, the Egyptian Military, and the United States from Mubarak to Sisi, and Social Unrest and American Military Bases in Turkey and Germany since 1945. And we have Daphne McCurdy. She is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a co-host of the Irregular Warfare podcast. She is also a Center for New American Security, Sean Brimley Next Generation National Security Leaders Fellow, Truman National Security Project Fellow, a Council on Foreign Relations term member, and a board member of RISI. Previously, Daphne served in USAID and the Department of State, where she oversaw stabilization and countering violent extremism efforts across the Middle East and Africa, including USAID Deputy Country Representative for Syria. And we have Hedil Owais. She is a Syrian-American writer focusing on the Middle East. She is currently news analyst for BBC Arabic, DW Arabic, and other major Arabic news platforms. Hedil is the host of the Washington Online Show for the North Press Agency that will be broadcast from Bethesda, Maryland, and will be focusing on Syria. In 2011, Hedil was arrested by the Assad regime for participating in the advocacy for political rights. Hedil relocated to the United States in 2012. And we have Joshua Landis, who is Sandra Mackey Chair and Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma in the Boren College of International Studies. He writes and manages SyriaComment.com, a daily newsletter on Syrian politics that attracts some 50,000 page reads a month. Dr. Landis publishes frequently in policy journals such as Foreign Affairs, Middle East Policy, and Foreign Policy. His book, Syria at Independence, Nationalism, Leadership, and Failure of Republicanism, will be published by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies this coming year. Hedil, I'd like to start with a retrospective question to you. You left Syria in 2011 after joining the protests and being detained by the Assad regime. What went wrong that Syrian people's aspirations in building democratic state turned into a bloody, never-ending civil war?
Yes, thank you so much for having me and organizing this great panel. Let me start a little bit like almost 20 years ago. I was 9 years old when Bashar al-Assad came to power in Syria. Many people in Syria were optimistic that this young new president, after decades of the rule of Hafez al-Assad, his father, will bring something new, will bring some freedom to Syria. Soon, a few years later, we started to witness the same things that took place under Hafez al-Assad, secular and political activists, just for saying anything against the regime, were thrown to jail for years under Bashar al-Assad, the new president. So this new generation that were in my age in 2011 at the beginning of the Arab Spring saw in the Arab Spring an opportunity to end this myth that Bashar al-Assad is a reformer and he's going to bring any change to Syria. A few days before the revolution in Syria, I was arrested in the city of Aleppo for distributing flyers that we called for protesting on March, and I was arrested for distributing these flyers. I was thrown in jail for 15 days. And when I was out of jail, protests were taking place in many cities around Syria. It started by young men and women like me. People protested Assad regime from all different groups of Syria, mainly students, mainly young people. But because of the nature of Assad regime, because of the brutality, because of the zero tolerance, hundreds or maybe thousands of people were thrown in jail. I lived in Egypt. I lived in many places around the Middle East later after the revolution, and also I have friends from these places, and I can tell you that Syria is maybe the North Korea of the Middle East. There is no place in the Middle East. I know it's very hard to say anything, to talk in politics, to be involved in politics in almost every single Arab country, but there is nothing like Syria. There is zero chance that you say anything against Assad regime and stay safe. So Assad regime dealt in a very brutal way with protesters. I was in many protests. When I was released from jail, I participated in protests in Aleppo suburbs, and I saw how they dealt with the protesters. They shoot at people, they shoot directly at people to kill them, not just to stop the protests, and they arrest thousands of people just for having relation with those who are protesting or they are from the same family. So the brutality of Assad regime was just like anything we knew before in Syria. And this is why many people like me who did not believe in using arm to go against Assad were either jailed by Assad, killed in prisons, or forced to leave Syria. With time, the part of the opposition that was able to survive and do more to go against Assad was the people who believed that attacking Assad in a military way will bring change to Syria, and also because those groups are more organized than us, than young people, secular people, because they are the only one who practiced politics in Syria, which are the Islamist groups. And those who are close to Islamist parties, they had the fund, they had the hierarchy to organize themselves. And of course, they had the belief that if they attack Assad militarily, they will end the rule of Assad, and they also believe that they have a religious reward for doing so, for fighting Assad under the name of jihad. And this thing ended any opportunity for changing Assad regime peacefully, because practically also it became a joke in Syria to say, let's change the regime peacefully in Syria, because you can't change the regime in Syria in a peaceful way. It's impossible. You will be, as I mentioned, you will be thrown in jail. There is no way that you say anything. Like until today, after all this change that took place in Syria and this brutal civil war, like few days ago, I heard about a journalist who worked for the state-owned Syrian TV station. She was thrown in jail. She was arrested by Assad regime for writing a Facebook status that is criticizing the economic collapse in Syria. She did not even criticize Assad or his clan. She just criticized the economic situation and corruption, and she ended up in jail. And she's from the people who supported Assad all these years. So those people, the Islamists, had something to say that you failed, you could not end this regime, so let's take the initiative in fighting this regime and ending its rule. And of course, these groups who fought Assad could not in his rule, could not be stronger militarily than Assad. And also they continued what Assad did in cracking down on secular opposition groups.
I'll get back to you, sorry, in terms of time. There will be second round of questions, and thank you so much for this opening. It's very needed, starting from a retrospective perspective, retrospectively understanding what happened. Now I'd like to come to today. Amy, in the big picture on Syria, what are the major policy shifts, if any, we may witness with the new Biden administration?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for organizing the panel on this important topic. So President Biden has not actually said a whole lot publicly yet about Syria. However, last week he did give a speech at the State Department about US foreign policy in general. And during that speech last week, last Thursday at the State Department, President Biden said, "We need to reclaim our credibility and moral authority." He also made very strong statements regarding the war in Yemen. He said very clearly, this war needs to end. And it is my hope that Biden will take a similarly bold and decisive steps regarding US policy towards Syria. And I would just like to focus on, because time is limited, 4 brief issues. And of course, I'm speaking in my personal capacity as an analyst and as an academic. First of all, the threat of ISIS continues in Syria. Just in the last month, in January 2021, there were, in the Northeast, there were 31 attacks. ISIS claimed responsibility for 29 of them. In the Al-Hol detention camp, where tens of thousands of ISIS detainees and their children are being detained, there were 19 residents who were killed, as well as 1 Asayish security guard. One of them was allegedly, at least one of them, possibly more, were beheaded. And it seems that they're still investigating what exactly happened, but it seems that these, within the Al-Hol camp, the ISIS people are still very supportive of ISIS, and that they're even ordering potentially executions to be carried out, often at night. And so this is clearly an ongoing issue that the United States will have to continue to work on together with our partners on the ground, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and our allies in the global coalition. I would urge the Biden administration, it has been longstanding policy to pressure all of the countries who have citizens that are being detained in Syria to take back their citizens to face justice in their home countries. There are still, to my knowledge, at least 2 US citizens who are also still being detained in Syria, in the Northeast, and the United States should bring back those US citizens. I believe it would be helpful to actually set a concrete timeline for other countries to take back their citizens. For example, June or July of this year. And if that does not happen within this time frame, the United States should then turn to other alternatives, to, for example, considering to support a tribunal to similar to the Nuremberg trials after World War II, because the victims of ISIS deserve to see justice. Secondly, the United States, of course, intervened in both Syria and Iraq in order to respond to the atrocities committed by the Islamic State, in particular, their targeting of religious minorities. Tragically, some of those very same religious minorities, in particular Yazidis and Christians, are still being subjected to further waves of violence as we speak. Just 2 days ago, the Christian region around Tel Temer has been targeted by militias that are operating under the Syrian National Army, the SNA, which of course is supported by Turkey. And these ongoing threats to these religious communities have to stop. It is absolutely unacceptable that we are still now facing potentially cases of ethnic cleansing of Yazidis and Christians, Kurds, who have fled from these regions as a result of the Turkish intervention in Afrin and also in Ras Al Ain Serikani in 2019. During my last visit to Syria in the fall, I personally met Yazidis, Christians, Kurds, and Arabs who were forcibly displaced from Serikani and are unable and unwilling to go back because they fear for their lives. So, you know, Erdogan may claim he only wants to remove the YPG or the SDF from the border region, but in reality, hundreds of thousands of people of all ethnic and religious backgrounds were affected by this intervention. And the Biden administration should make it possible for these innocent civilians to go back to their homes. Second of all, or rather third, you know, Biden has made clear that he wants to prioritize in the United States the inclusion of women in his here in his own cabinet. And you know, if we look at the situation in Syria, we also, if we compare, for example, the different governance structures in the regime-held territories and the territories held by Turkey and in the territories in the Northeast under the control of the autonomous administration, there's no question that in the Northeast, under the autonomous administration, you have the highest levels of women's participation, not just in the SDF or the YPG, but also in the civilian administration. And decades of research show that including women in conflict prevention and post-conflict resolution is associated with improved outcomes. So decades of research across countries, different regions of the world shows that including women in post-conflict resolution is associated with improved outcomes in terms of improved national security. And yet, ironically, and this brings me to my final point, this part of Syria that has the highest levels of women's inclusion in the local autonomous administration is excluded from the talks in Geneva over the future of Syria. And it is unacceptable for 1/3 of Syria to be excluded from the talks in Geneva that are supposed to determine the future of Syria. And so I would hope that Biden, together with our allies and partners, for example, in the Syria Small Group, the other 7 countries, that we would all urge that the autonomous administration should be included in the talks in Geneva, because that is the only way to find a potentially, you know, peaceful resolution to the conflict that actually includes the voices of all of Syrian society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. And Daphne, Syria has become the worst humanitarian crisis in recent memory. Do we know the Biden administration stands on plight of Syrian civilians in Idlib and other places? Is there any humanitarian agenda in shape?
Well, first, thank you, Mustafa, for organizing this important conversation. And I'm really honored to be a part of it with such esteemed colleagues. I think to answer this question, we first need to start by acknowledging that Syria will likely not be a top priority for the Biden administration. First, because there are so many domestic issues on Biden's plate, but also when we think about foreign policy, there is just going to be a broader shift away from the Middle East. And so I think that really limits both how much leverage we have and bandwidth we have in achieving major outcomes in Syria. Now, by contrast, I think addressing humanitarian crises around the world is a priority for this administration. And as Amy mentioned, I think this is part of the administration's focus on restoring its moral authority on the world stage. I think one obvious indication of this is the appointment of a high-profile diplomat like Ambassador Samantha Power to USAID, which oversees humanitarian assistance, as well as the elevation of USAID to a seat on the National Security Council. So when you take those two realities together, what I think that means is that improving the humanitarian situation in Syria is a place where the US will not only want to focus its limited bandwidth, but where sustained attention and engagement is actually an issue where we can actually achieve positive outcomes, because this is where our leverage really lies, because we are the biggest donor, single donor of humanitarian assistance to Syria. And I don't think we can overstate just how dire the humanitarian situation is in a country where the majority of the population is aid dependent, where 90% of the population lives in poverty, where over half of the pre-war population is displaced inside or outside the country. Getting some wins on humanitarian access and improving the humanitarian situation could actually be a major win for US policy. And so in this realm, I really see two priority issues. The first is on the renewal of the cross-border assistance mechanism into northwest Syria, which includes Idlib. And the second is on reforming the broader assistance paradigm in regime-held Syria. And just given time, I'm just going to focus right now on that first point, and then happy to delve into that second point in the Q&A. So on this first point, this is going to be really one of the first real tests for the US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, at the Security Council, because the reauthorization of this cross-border mechanism comes up for a vote at the Security Council in July. And to start, let me just give a little bit of context on what this cross-border authorization is. So humanitarian assistance in Syria is not only a consequence of the conflict, it is a tool in the conflict. And by that, what I mean is that the Assad regime has used humanitarian aid as a weapon of war to both reward its supporters and to punish its opponents. And what that's looked like is that life-saving aid has been denied to the people who need it most, and humanitarian workers, doctors, and key infrastructure like healthcare have been directly targeted in the war. And so in an effort to overcome the regime's obstruction to humanitarian aid, in 2014, the UN Security Council authorized the delivery of humanitarian assistance without the permission of the government through 4 border crossings, 2 in Turkey, 1 in Iraq, and 1 in Jordan. And these authorizations were renewed every year until late 2019, when the Russians vetoed the Iraq and Jordan crossings. And then more recently, this past July, the Russians, along with the Chinese, vetoed again the remaining 2 border crossings in Turkey. I'm sorry, 1 of the border crossings in Turkey. And so now there is only 1 border crossing remaining that goes to Idlib. And this authorization is up for renewal this upcoming July. So the good news is that this issue is very much on the radar of both Ambassador Greenfield, who talked about the issue in her confirmation hearings a couple weeks ago, as well as Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who actually tweeted about this vote back in July during the campaign. I think it was actually the only time he tweeted about Syria. So I think that's a good indication of how important this issue is for them. I think the fact that they both have the President Biden's ear is also incredibly important, because while Ambassador Jeffrey also prioritized this issue, the buck sort of stopped with him, and he didn't have the backing of Pompeo or President Trump the way this new administration does. And that's really important for diplomacy at the UN, where the Russians in particular are very adept at pressuring the UN and the Secretary General, and really put a lot of weight in diplomacy at the UN Security Council. The bad news is that the Russians are very unlikely to approve the renewal of this authorization. And they've made that pretty clear. In fact, just last week, the Russian ambassador to the UN stated explicitly that he does not plan to renew the authorization. And this is because this issue is not just about humanitarian aid for the Russians or the regime. It's really about the country's sovereignty and demonstrating that Bashar al-Assad has won this war, and he has the authority as the sovereign of his country to determine where assistance is based. And so convincing the Russians that we should keep this authorization open is going to be very, very difficult. So where does that leave us? I think the US should be doing everything in its power and using every tool in its diplomatic toolbox to pressure the Russians to keep this border crossing open. But I think we also need to be realistic and prepare for the very real possibility that it won't be left open, and we need to prepare contingency plans. I'm happy to, in the Q&A, get into what those contingency plans could be, but given time, I'll just stop here. What I will say is that, sadly, all of our alternative plans are pretty suboptimal, but it's better than not preparing for them and facing a scenario in which we're left with no cross-border authorization at all. So thank you.
Thank you. And Aaron, is there any hope left for the opposition against the regime? What are the major actors and what may be their perception of the Biden administration?
First of all, thank you for having me. Second of all, I want to commend both you and Josh for putting on a suit and tie during a pandemic. I still stick around with a t-shirt, so I'm slumming for the rest of the Zoom. Well, I hate to be the pessimist here, but I frankly, I don't see Syria being a high priority for the Biden administration. I just don't see that at all. But ultimately, I don't see the Syrian opposition being a critical factor in determining how that limited focus on Syria will be in this Biden administration as a driving actor of how the U.S. thinks about this policy. I think as we narrow goals in the U.S., narrow policy prescriptions in the U.S., I do think it will be what Daphne talks about, which is prioritizing humanitarian assistance after the expected Russian veto, and how to balance counterterrorism concerns against the Islamic State at a time when there will be overarching pressure to decrease U.S. presence in the Middle East writ large. If we looked around just last week, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin began a global posture review. I don't think it's any secret how it's going to turn out, which is we need more in Indo-Pacific and we need less in the Central Command area of responsibilities, and about the same in Europe, right? So you're going to have to take some away. Does that mean that the U.S. is going to be withdrawing from Syria? To be determined. My guess is probably not, just getting a read on this. But just to focus is where this will going, is I do think is that the dynamics will eventually try and push for a more direct bilateral discussion between Moscow and Washington over Syria moving forward. And I think that those dynamics will in some respects be sort of like what's evolved between the Turks and the Russians, which is like the Syrian opposition are nominally and ostensibly part of that conversation, but not really, right? It's really the two capitals that negotiate ostensibly on their behalf, but again, not really, to try and get their preferred outcome. Within this, there is a sort of line out there that the Turks were decisive in rolling back and are capable of deterring Russian and regime operations in the region, in the Middle East, in Idlib, excuse me, moving forward. Now, while that may be true, and while the Turks' willingness to use force previously may give the regime or the Russians second thought, I think we should all remember is that ultimately when that brief conflict ended, it ended on the terms that Moscow had pushed for, which was the regime de facto control over both the M4 and M5 highways moving forward. And a continued position of essentially Russians negotiating from a position of strength rather than a position of weakness. And so I see these sort of confluence of factors as quite negative. But, and again, this is not meant to be sort of flippant, but simplifying in terms of U.S. policy options, because the route to at least negotiating U.S. options in the country runs through Moscow now, rather than through the various and rather fractured opposition elements that had basically before the Trump administration dominated policy. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll have second round of questions to all of you, and this is great. Thank you. Joshua, on the Syrian regime's struggle to regain the territories, what are the key priorities and how they may change, if any, with the new administration in Washington?
Well, as you know, Syrian government only controls about 70, maybe 65, 70% of the Syrian territory. And of course, it wants to get back total sovereignty. Russia says it supports that sovereignty. Even the United States says it supports Syrian sovereignty, but of course they want a government change and a imposition of the UN resolutions, which would cause for a political change in Damascus. And that's where we get into this larger struggle over the border issues and aid. America has used foreign aid to the opposition as a tool against Damascus, and Damascus has used it as a tool against the opposition, trying to starve the opposition. America's trying to feed the opposition. And so this is a struggle over who's going to control Syria. And the United States, seems quite clearly, is trying to deny as much Syrian territory to the Damascus regime as possible. So is Turkey and so forth. What is Assad going to do? Assad, I think, is going to focus on the northeast, the Kurdish region, because that's the soft spot. It's a multi-ethnic region. Arabs are unhappy in the region about the power that America has helped the Kurds gain and the way that America has dealt to the Kurds. For example, the oil and so forth deal has been negotiated with the Kurds. So already we're seeing a rise in the level of violence in the northeast, and Assad is going to try to exploit that. Of course, Turkey is going to try to exploit that because Turkey doesn't want the Americans there either. Neither does Assad. And I think that's the weak point. And he'll focus on that. Of course, he cannot. Assad is extraordinarily weak today. The country is in paralysis economically. So it's not going to take on Turkey in Idlib, for example, and it can't take on the United States at Tunf and other areas where the United States has troops and is closing the border, for example, at Tunf, which is so important to Damascus to get trade moving between Iraq, Baghdad, and Damascus. The main highway is shut off by the United States in order to starve Damascus. And that's something that I think Damascus will try to get open. The northeast is a weak spot. It's important to Damascus because there's oil there as well. America's trying to starve Damascus, keep the oil away. And unfortunately, the Syrian people have become the pawns in this larger geostrategic struggle over who's going to control Syrian territory.
Thank you. Now we will have the second round of questions, but this time, please, short answers so that we will have some Q&A at the end. So I'm turning to you, Hadeel. As a Syrian journalist, what tools do you think the Biden administration can use in approaching the Syrian crisis in a different way?
Yes, the Syrian opposition generally would criticize President Obama for not giving enough help for the Syrian opposition to help change the regime or change the situation in Syria. But now, after all these years, we see that change in Syria can't come from Washington. It's impossible to make change from here, from Washington. I believe that the Syrian opposition took a lot of chances under President Obama, more than under President Trump. Today, it's very complex on the ground. I agree with everyone else that Syria can't be a priority, and it's really complex. We have now in northeast Syria territories under the fighters affiliated with Turkey, and we see a model that's not what most of the Syrians can't live under. Al-Qaeda still infiltrate many of these areas. There is political oppression, but there is also social oppression that did not exist under Assad regime in many cases. So it's very hard to affiliate with this model under a Biden administration. In my opinion, the bright side of what happened in Syria is the model of Northeast Syria. Today in Northeast Syria, we have a system that's at least better than what we witnessed under Assad regime. There is a system of checks and balances. There is there is real role for women in Northeast Syria. There is no role for women in Northwest Syria. There is in my opinion, the support for Northeast Syria should continue, and I consider it like it was the minimal if we compare it with what the opposition received at the first years of the uprising. So maintaining some sort of stability in Northeast Syria and thinking more about the decentralization model of governing in Syria would be a great thing. Pushing for it politically from Washington. I don't think Washington has all the tools to make a change, but I think decentralization model, looking at the model of Northeast Syria, would be a great idea. Diversity in Syria is a big thing. It's a great thing, but it's also a source of many problems in Syria, because you can't govern all the Syrians in one governance style. It's not only Sunnis, Arabs, Kurds, and Christians. It's also, for example, the Sunnis of Aleppo are different than the Sunnis of Damascus and of Idlib, and they can't live all under the same system. So I think thinking about decentralization and empowering local governments would be a great thing to do.
So I'll like to continue on Northern Syria issues. Amy, you were the first expert who have conducted a field survey of SDF based on numerous trips to all 6 provinces in northeastern Syria in the past few years. Do we know what will be primary goals of the Biden team in terms of the U.S. presence in Syria, eastern Syria, based on your field trips?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So I agree with Aaron. Actually, I believe that the U.S., the small U.S. presence that is in the eastern part of Syria will remain. Biden has expressed support for the by, with, and through strategy of working with our local partners on the ground. And so I think this will continue. I also believe I would like to, however, I guess I would like to first mention one point about the survey that you just mentioned that I conducted of the Syrian Democratic Forces in all of the 6 different governorates, if you want to call it that, or provinces of Northeast Syria. One of the findings was, because it was a question, I had a questionnaire. I asked them about their age, where they were born, their tribe, etc. And I found, actually to my surprise, that the survey respondents identified as belonging to 46 different tribes or sub-tribes or clans within Syria. And so this is, I think, quite remarkable. And this includes some of the Arab tribes that in the past had been used by the Assad regime to suppress the Kurdish minority. So for example, some of the Arab tribes that had been used in the Arabization policies or the creation of the Arab Belt in the north, that you had members of those tribes, for example, which are now part of the SDF and which are cooperating and have been members of the SDF for years. So I also asked on the survey when they joined the SDF, and there were Arabs, for example, from Ras Al Ain who joined in 2015, before the SDF was even created, when it was still the YPG. I found Arabs who had joined the SDF from Homs, which obviously is in regime territory, from Aleppo, also in regime territory. So I respectfully disagree with Joshua Landis that all of the Arabs are somehow angry at the Kurds. That's simply not true. Yes, you do have disagreements, and there is still, of course, ongoing tensions, and there's ongoing sectarianism in the northeast, as in other parts of Syria. But I believe that the Syrian Democratic Forces, because they are the only armed group in Syria that does not discriminate on the basis of gender, ethnicity, tribe, religion, that they have actually made some small progress in overcoming the legacy of sectarianism and Arab nationalism promoted by the Ba'athist regime, and of course the religious hatred promoted by ISIS. And so I think in addition to being our partners in terms of defeating ISIS and continuing to ensure that the sleeper cells are not able to continue to carry out attacks, from a sociological perspective, the fact that you have this cooperation within the SDF for years now, not just 1 year or 2 years, but 5, 6 years, it's something quite significant. And I think that this kind of cooperation within the SDF and within the autonomous administration should be encouraged. And I'll just leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Daphne, in your recent report, you argue that in eastern Syria, US policymakers have sought to leverage stabilization efforts to counter Iranian and Russian influence, which resulted in limited success and moral dilemmas. Could you please explain it for us?
Sure. And to start, let me just make an important, if wonky, point and distinction. So in your first question, you asked about humanitarian assistance, which in theory should be driven entirely by the needs of the population and upholding humanitarian principles like impartiality and neutrality. In this question, you're asking about stabilization assistance, which can oftentimes look very similar to humanitarian assistance, but is very different in terms of its motivations, and it's politically oriented, and in that way can serve as a tool for achieving geostrategic outcomes. So just important to make that point, because I think the US government in particular really does see these as two different tools. So on our paper, which I recently co-authored with my colleague Francis Brown, we tried to, in the spirit of the Biden administration's emphasis on using civilian tools, whether they're diplomatic or development, to advance our national security interests, we examined how stabilization assistance could be used to have the US compete against our geostrategic rivals in places like Syria. And the reason that we think that this is a potentially useful tool is that geostrategic competition really often plays out in fragile or affected states like Syria, where there's power vacuums that can be exploited by external actors. And so we've obviously seen this in Syria, where you have not only the Russians and the Iranians present, but you also have the Turks there. You have the Israelis in the sky. And so what we think that stabilization assistance can do in these situations is that it can help buttress local authorities that are legitimate to stand up against external meddling and influence. Now, all that said, I think in Syria, we really haven't used these tools as strategically as we could have. And there's a myriad of reasons for that. The first is that we are already starting at a disadvantage in a place like Syria against countries like Iran and Russia, who have had historically long relationships in these places. And so in many ways, we're playing catch up to these other actors. The second big challenge is that whereas Russia and Iran have approached their stabilization type activities as part of a broader strategy in the whole of the country because they support the Syrian government, our activities are really focused exclusively on the Northeast, and they don't tie into this broader political end state. And so it's not really clear what all of these stabilization activities we're doing are building towards. And then the third major challenge that has been discussed already is just the fact that, particularly under Trump administration, we've had a rather erratic and reckless policy towards Syria, which has exacerbated these other issues that I've mentioned. And so in the face of budget cuts, in the face of military withdrawals and uncertainty about troop presence, it's been very difficult for stabilization efforts to really optimize their goals and know what they're building towards. And frankly, has made us look like an unreliable, fickle partner. Now, I think we've overcome a lot of that damage, but I think there is still this wariness among our local partners about how committed we are to the Syrians' political outcome. Now, I think where we do have an advantage vis-a-vis countries like Iran or Russia is that when we promote soft power, we really do it through soft power, as opposed to Russia and Iran, who really use sectarian or militaristic means to advance even soft power goals. So for example, when you look at the Russians and the Iranians doling out humanitarian aid in Syria, they still do it primarily through militias or their military police. And so it's seen as this coercive tool rather than something to, as a soft power tool. And so to get to your original question, Mustafa, about the moral dilemmas associated here, I think the issue is that while our soft power can be an advantage, there is also this temptation potentially to use stabilization assistance to advance geopolitical goals through potentially ruthless means, the way that the Russians and Iranians do. And so I think we need to have this constant adjudication about whether our geopolitical aims are the same as our stabilization aims, and ensure that our geopolitical aims are not upending our stabilization goals of trying to promote legitimate governance in these places.
Thank you. Aaron, a big unknown in Syria complex is the future of Idlib. What's likely to observe in Idlib during the Biden administration?
I mean, it's a good question. The short answer is I don't know. I think the longer answer is that it's dependent upon, the political calculations of the regime, the Russians, and the Turks. I do think that we've entered into sort of this static, place where much of the entirety of the conflict's front lines have solidified. And along those front lines, yes, you have intermittent clashes, but they're more or less stable. The ultimate problem areas for the US is the undoubted sort of ISIS resurgence, or at least sort of continuance in certain parts of the country out in the eastern desert. And then the broader question about who actually governs Idlib. And the undeniable presence of Al-Qaeda cells within there, but also a sort of, I don't know what we call them, but, group that basically runs the place that at one point was a direct affiliate of Al-Qaeda, but has since broken, and is trying to soften its image over the past couple of years. And in doing so has won support, at least indirect support from Turkey. To try and prevent just the mass collapse of that place. I think in a perfect world, you want everything to stay as is, because the outcomes of a renewed offensive or fighting are just catastrophic from a humanitarian purpose. And if you do see a drop off in aid because of the moves of the Russians and the regime, it could be sort of even in excess of catastrophic. I don't even know what that word is. But the fundamental tension that runs through here, and then I'll stop, is that it's come through the three different panels. For American policy, the beyond what Daphne was talking about, which was just what was stabilization assistance, is you have the overarching legal authorities in there that the SDF is undeniably made up, at least at the core, at the leadership level, of a U.S. designated terrorist group, and at the core of the Northwest is a U.S. designated terrorist group. And so our options are very, very limited in terms of what we can do from a legalistic point of view, and you can't pump more stabilization aid, say, into the Northeast without running afoul of those designations and then drawing into a broader question about what to do about Turkey. You can't pump in stabilization assistance into the Northwest without risking empowering Al-Qaeda. Even if they are going to reform, the problem is that there are safe space and havens within that place from which they can direct external attacks. I think that's a low probability that they would do such a thing, but you can imagine the political debates playing out back home. So we are stuck in this sort of status quo policy because we won't make nice with Bashar for ultimately good reasons. We won't countenance serious talks with Russians about the future of Syria because of the status of Bashar al-Assad, but any future stabilization assistance pumped into the Northeast risks breaking the country apart, which is against U.S. policy, and empowering the PKK. And the Northwest, you risk empowering at least an Al-Qaeda quasi-sympathetic, perhaps affiliate, whatever they are at this point, running into the place. So the U.S. options are all very bad here. They lead you to sort of like ancillary things, like debating definitions of who is a terrorist and who isn't, which is fun academically and leads to good field research. Particularly the latest work on HTS, I think, has been excellent. But it's ultimately ancillary to the main questions of U.S. policy. So I hope Idlib stays the same. But, I guess that's the best case scenario is that we just remain in stalemate.
Thank you. Joshua, I'd like to ask my final question about the expectations of Iran and Russia. What are the potential strategic changes in their calculus in the Biden era?
Well, the Trump administration used Turkey as its hammer against Russia and Iran by allowing Turkey to take extra territory in the northeast, to hit the Kurds pretty badly in order to counter the PKK that Aaron was talking about that upset Turkey so much. So the United States under Trump was able to use, and by doing that, by allowing Turkey to take territory in the north of Syria, you're limiting Assad, you're limiting Iran, because Assad regime and the Damascus has been turned into a very, very poor government that can't provide basic state things to the people like electricity and schooling and so forth. So the Syrian people are being starved in order to make Iran and Russia pour money into Syria, something they don't want to do. So it's been hobbled. Now, the Biden is less likely to be so friendly to Turkey. Although it's going to have a very hard time, I think, like Aaron underlined, it's going to have a very hard time really pulling in the reins on Turkey, because the United States policy as it is today needs Turkey in Syria in order to deny that territory from Assad and keep him weak. What the Biden administration, a few people have been talking about, is federalism in Syria. They want some sort of federalism, but that's in a sense a code word for keeping the territory, the Northeast, Idlib, and so forth, out of the hands of Assad. And the real problem is that US policy is predicated on keeping Assad, trying to change Assad somehow and impose these UN resolutions that mean for a dramatic political change in Damascus. And until that happens, the United States isn't going to really normalize relations. But because there's no American troops on the ground, you need to use foreigners. You need to use Turkey and so forth, which means that you activate Turkey's ambitions, which are to stay in those territories. Turkey's just started to build a university in North Aleppo. That's not the action of somebody who's thinking of withdrawing anytime soon. Now, how does Russia, Russia is going to try to counteract this attempt to draw Turkey out of Russia's orbit by the United States, draw Turkey out of Russia's orbit, and we'll have to see how that's going to force Biden back into a pro-Turkish policy. Now, of course, the big thing is Iran, and Iran is really sucking the oxygen out of the room today, because trying to get back to the Iran deal means softening towards Iran. And that's upset Israel, it's upset Saudi Arabia, it's upset our major allies in the region. So therefore, to be softer on Syria is going to be extremely hard for the United States and for Biden. And in some ways, he's going to have to be tough on Syria and Assad to balance what he's doing with Iran. And that means not making many concessions about Syria. And the administration in Washington hasn't pulled its pants up on Syria yet. We don't even have a Syrian envoy designated. There's some discussion about Feltzman and so forth. And he just published an article saying federalism in Syria. So we don't really know, Syria's at the end of the chain. I think everybody has agreed on that. Syria is the last country that's going to get a lot of attention from Washington, because there aren't good solutions in Syria. And that's been a real problem. If I could address one question that Amy said, and this comes to the same policy, which is, I don't think the Arabs are against what America's doing or against what the Kurds are doing in the Northeast. Every account I have had, just like Amy says, this is a much kinder and nicer administration today in the Northeast of Syria than it is in the rest of Syria. And of course, you've got American aid. But the point is that America is going to withdraw from that area eventually. It's not going to stay there forever. And that area, the Kurds do not have an air force. Assad is going to pound them the moment America withdraws, unless Assad is changed first. And we have no indication that Assad is leaving power. There is no opposition in Syria that can overturn him. He won this war despite all the efforts of his opponents. And the Kurds are sitting ducks because they're weak and they're poor. And Assad has an army. So if the United States withdraws, the Kurds are going to have to make a deal with Damascus. A deal that's not going to be good for them, not as good as what they have under the United States. And so that administration is going to crumble. It may not be for 4 years under Biden. Biden is in a sense promised he's going to keep it up. And it may not be even the next administration because they won't want to drop it. But somebody is going to come along in the America and say, what are we doing here? Are we going to turn 2 million Kurds in Syria into an independent nation? And I don't think they will. And that's going to leave the Kurds in a terrible situation, which they've been in before. And ultimately, Washington's going to factor that into what they're doing in the Northeast. They're not going to spend a lot of money because it's going to eventually be taken over by Damascus, because America recognizes the sovereignty of Damascus over all of Syria, legally. And everything else is a temporary move that they're making today.
Thank you. And I'd like to now turn to the audience for questions. And I see there are some arrived in the chat box. We have about 15 minutes. So I see Professor Daniel Serber of Johns Hopkins University. He is asking, and to the entire panel, why is UN Security Council approval needed for cross-border aid? Why don't we just go ahead and do it? Will Russia or Turkey stop it? Would like to take this?
I can take it as the aid person here. I think it's a really good question, and the answer is we can do it, but the longer answer is it's going to be suboptimal, and the reason is that actually pre-2014. In Northwest Syria, this was what we were doing. We were having NGOs operate cross-border from Turkey. And in fact, in the Northeast, we do the same thing. With the closure of the Iraq border at the end of 2019, NGOs were already mostly relying on Fishkapur border, which is further up north in Iraq, which is not an official border. So it's possible and we can do it. The issue is that it's not nearly at the scale that the current operation is at. And when you take away the UN authorization, you take away the UN's operations. And without the UN, and we can have a conversation too about all of the flaws of the UN system, but the UN is no one else can operate at the scale that the UN does. And so they are both the coordinator of all of this assistance, and they're the ones really responsible for the sheer scale of assistance pouring into Northwest Syria. And so when you take them out, NGOs could continue to operate, but it's gonna look very, very different, and it's not going to be nearly at the same scale that it is within the UN umbrella.
Any other takes on this, or should I move to the next question?
I just say that international law means that you can't just go over people's borders and start setting up shop. And the UN recognizes that, and so they won't deliver aid across borders when Assad says no. And Assad is the recognized government of Syria. So there is a legal problem with just driving across people's borders and providing aid. You can do it. America has been doing it, but it's a problem in a long term by having you've got to get international recognition of the ability to do that. And Russia and China can veto it, which they do regularly in the Security Council. If I'm correct, Daphne, on that.
It is. So just to clarify very quickly, if they veto it, the UN will no longer operate because it defers to that UN security authorization. That does not necessarily extend to international NGOs. And so they can choose to continue operating cross-border without the Syrian government's approval. And what they would argue, and I think the Americans would argue too, is that while you're absolutely right, Professor Landis, that typically the way international humanitarian law works is that the sovereign state has the authority to decide how assistance is delivered. Because the Syrian regime is not adhering to humanitarian principles and is not allowing aid to reach the people who need it most, international NGOs should have the prerogative of being able to deliver this assistance to those who need it most without the permission of the Syrian government.
Okay, so there are two questions that I like to combine. One of the most important issues for the future of Syria is the fate of the huge number of political detainees. How do panel members think that this issue could be best addressed in the context of sanctions and other policy instruments? And the other question, relatedly, do you think the role of sanctions will increase or decrease with the Biden administration? And this is everyone in the panel, so would you like, if anyone would like to go ahead, please do. Aaron, would you like to? I saw that you opened your microphone.
Well, I'll just say on sanctions, we both underestimate the power of U.S. sanctions and underestimate the power of U.S. sanctions. And by underestimate, we tend to say that we overuse sanctions, and because we overuse sanctions, we will ultimately lead to a place where the dollar is no longer the reserve currency and everybody will give us the giant one finger salute and will go about their business. That's just not true. And ultimately the efficacy of US sanctions, particularly secondary sanctions, both on Syria and Iran, are quite effective. But quite effective in doing what? Have sanctions generated leverage to get to a sustained political outcome that we want? I think that's without question that the U.S. sanctions have weakened the Assad regime. I think it's without question is that the sanctions on Iran have weakened their ability to float the Syrian regime. But will sanctions be able to coerce the Syrian regime to do things that they don't want? And thus far, the answer is no. And so those political detainees, that will ultimately come down to a political decision on behalf of the Assad regime to release them either as part of a political choice Damascus makes, that as part of a bucket of issues is to try and get rid of some of these sanctions, or they won't. So I always think that the answer to these questions are behind the opacity of the regime, of which I don't really ever interact with.
So I move on to another question. Navar Shaban from Umran Center, he's asking to Hadeel, what are the actual criteria for success in the SDF-held areas? And what is preventing this success from happening in other areas in Syria?
Yes, thank you. So one big thing in northeast Syria is that the military command fall under a civilian government. In northeast Syria, there are politicians who are taking care of local governments who take care of the issues of the people. In northwest Syria, everything is militarized, and the people who are the fighters in west Syria and in Turkey-controlled cities are they tend to be related to Islamist groups, and they take care of everything. Now in northwest Syria, if you want to rent a house, you have to know someone from these military groups. You have to go through these groups. Any politician who belongs to the Syrian opposition is not in these areas. They are in hotels in Istanbul or in Europe. So there is no political activism in northwest Syria, and this is a big difference. I think this thing also is giving a leverage to northeast Syria and to the model of SDF and the Kurdish administration. It's implementing a status quo that's positive for northeast Syria, even after, if let's say the US withdraw. And this situation, the political situation, is not, in my opinion, related to the US support or to the US presence in northwest Syria, Turkey-controlled areas now. There is no war. There is no fight. Turkey agreed with Russia that there will be no attacks, and there is no attacks, and yet there is no success in implementing any political governments there. So this is giving a good thing for the people, the civilians who live in northeast Syria, and also for the administration of the political administration related to SDF, which is SDC. It's giving them ability also and flexibility to make relations with Russia, with different parties and players on the ground in Syria, and it makes it harder for Assad regime also in the future to just wait for the minute that the US will withdraw. They just can easily and simply attack, and it's making it an attractive model even for the Russians, for the different players on the ground in Syria. And I think the problem why it's not the case in northwest Syria, because the nature of the Islamist fighters in northwest Syria is just they want to oust everybody else, and it's hard to have a political governance under fighters and groups like this.
Thank you. I'd like to squeeze another question or two. What can be done with Syrian fighters who have been exported to other conflicts like in Libya or Nagorno-Karabakh? Is there truth to these reports in the first place? And generally, what kind of demobilization strategies exist to rehabilitate so maybe young people have grown up in this conflict to be rehabilitated? That's the question. And again, it's to all panelists.
Well, yes, the reports are true. You know, this points to the longer term issue that the Turks are going to be dealing with, you know, which is that, you know, the catastrophic outcomes of the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, which we ultimately don't really talk about in terms of proliferation issues. We tend to focus on the really big nasty ones, which is, you know, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons. But the single biggest killer in proliferation is the amount of small arms that are available all over the world. And, you know, there are study after study in development journals and humanitarian aid journals about the legacy and the enduring legacy of the proliferation of light weapons in terms of setting back society. So I think this is ultimately going to be one of the major stunting factors in the rehabilitation of Syrian society, you know, leaving aside the catastrophes perpetrated on these people by the Assad regime and its enablers. But I know the Turks, you know, I mean, Turkey is the country I'm most familiar with, are acutely aware of this. And it's one of the reasons they invested so heavily into the Northeast and Northwest in places that they control. It is monetarily and politically cheaper and ultimately to their security benefit to push these people out of their own country and to put them in Syria. So it costs less to, say, build a university in Syria than it does to pay for university education for all these Syrians that go there. So, I mean, this is just the problem that will keep on giving, you know, 20, 30 years into the future.
So, Amy.
Sorry, I was just going to add a quick point, if that's okay, Mustafa, on this point. And I'll be just very quick. I just wanted to add the very tragic human element in all of this. And I think Liz Surkoff's done some really great research looking at the motivations behind these Syrian fighters who are going and fighting in places far from home, like Libya or Nagorno-Karabakh. And it's just absolutely devastating. I mean, these are people who have lost everything, and the Turks exploit this and are able to give them higher salaries to go fight in Libya rather than fight in their own country. And so it's just really, really tragic. And I think, you know, oftentimes we look at these people as fighters, but like at the end of the day, they're individuals who've lost everything, and they're not necessarily, I think oftentimes when we think about rehabilitation programs or countering extremism programs, we focus a lot on the ideological aspects of their motivations. But in this case, I think oftentimes in a protracted conflict like Syria, you have people who are motivated by just trying to, and especially in an economic crisis, just try to make money. And that doesn't make it any easier to solve, but I just think it's important to think about that when we try to think, you know, 10 years down the road, when hopefully Syria is overcoming this conflict, how you deal with these people who maybe never wanted to be fighters, but really had no other choice but to become fighters.
So Amy, would you like to have a final word on rehabilitation? We are running out of time. Very short, please.
Right, sure. Look, I would just say that I think, you know, as Daphne said, these people who have joined these different militia groups, they are human beings. The economic situation is dire, as everybody here has pointed out. And if you look at the various factions, for example, within the Syrian National Army backed by Turkey, you know, you have some that have clearly committed human rights violations, war crimes, assassinated women, for example, engaged in forced marriage, like Ahrar al-Shakir, Hamza Division, Sultan Murad. And in my opinion, those groups should be sanctioned by the United States. There are other groups that haven't done those horrible things. And so, of course, we have to differentiate between these different groups. But, you know, as Erin pointed out, the reports about them being shipped to Nagorno-Karabakh, for example, have been confirmed. And of course, we have to also look at the state actors that enabled that to happen. It's not just the proliferation of light weaponry, which of course is also a role, plays a role. And finally, I would just like to make one last comment. I mean, regarding what Joshua, you know, what you said about the UN and the potential independent Kurdish state, the Kurdish movement affiliated with the PYD and the PKK gave up the idea of an independent Kurdistan 20 years ago. And the autonomous administration have been saying for years, since 2012, that they want to remain part of Syria. And yet it is the international community that excludes them from Geneva that potentially is strengthening any remaining separatist tendencies in the movement by treating them as if they were a separate entity, not part of Syria. And so again, this is just one more reason why including them in these talks, I think, is absolutely necessary to find a resolution to the conflict.
So thank you all. This was a great panel. Thanks to everyone for contributing this. And of course, thanks to our audience. And please stay tuned for our future event on Syria in next few weeks. So have a wonderful week. We are ending our event now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa.
Mustafa.
Thank you.